Hey everybody, this is Tao at the Forge, and today I want to talk to you guys about some of my favorite decks to play in Arena. Now, the reason why I want to say this is just because a lot of times people they're getting into Arena and they want to know what to play. You know, there's so many choices right now of things that you can play. Yes, I know you could just play Oko decks, and you know that seems to be the dominant choice nowadays. Surprisingly, none of my decks are Oko decks. But anyways, if you're not interested in playing Oko decks, then I'd like to go over some of my favorite ones, and I'll talk to you about like how they are good to play and which ones are the more fun, and depending on your style, which you might like. All right, so I'm going to go over my top 5 decks. So here we go. Now, the first one is the Smitten Shotgun deck. Let's take a look here. Okay, so Smitten Shotgun basically wants to revolve around this card here, Smitten Swordmaster. All right, so Smitten Swordmaster and has a sorcery effect called Curry Favor. Now, Curry Favor says that you can gain X life and each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of knights you control. All right, so ideally you want to kind of cast this and just blast your opponent, and that's why they call it Smitten Shotgun. All right, so well, how do you play this then, right? So obviously you need a lot of knights. So what you're going to do is we're going to play a lot of things like this, like Filemire Knight, Knight of the Ebon Legion, right? Blacklands Paragon, Order of Midnight, of course, Smitten Swordmaster, Midnight Reaper, Murderous Rider, and that's pretty much it. All right. Now, how are we going to get all these knights onto the battlefield? Well, what we do is we actually kind of have some doubling effects, such as the Edgewall Innkeeper. Now, it's not really a doubling effect, but whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, you get to draw a card. All right, and we also play Lucky Clover. So Lucky Clover says, whenever you cast an adventure, instant, or sorcery spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. Now, as you may remember of my recent banned and restricted video, I think that Lucky Clover should be banned because it's just so good. Right, like it's just too much value that you get, and you can see. I'll show you guys why this is, later. All right, so well, we can talk about it right now, actually. So when you cast Filemire Knight, if you happen to get to the 4 mana, like it's not a bad thing to just cast them for 1, right? Because very often your opponent is going to not going to want to attack into a 1/1 Death Toucher, so that's okay. Now, if you have an Innkeeper, you cast a Filemire Knight, and then you get another card. If you happen to get it later on in the game, and you happen to have a Lucky Clover out, when you cast this, you lose 2 life, but you also draw 2 cards. Now, that's alright because you're not going to be short on life, and you can get low to life because basically you're going to cast Smitten Swordmaster later and get all your life back anyways. Alright, so Knight of the Ebon Legion, just as good value because it can become a 3/3 with Death Touch. So very often, especially if I'm at that 4 mana part here, or 3 mana where I can cast this Profane Insight and draw a card, I'll just hold it up with Knight of the Ebon Legion. So I'm not attacking. I'll just leave Knight of the Ebon Legion up for defense and threaten that I could give him +3/+3 in Death Touch. Then it's very unlikely that your opponent's just going to attack into him. So if your opponent does attack into him, okay, give him 3/3 and make him a 4/5 with Death Touch. You may lose him. You kind of don't want to lose him, but sometimes it's required. But if your opponent doesn't attack into him, then you can instant speed this one, and you can draw a card and draw 2 cards, right? Edgewall Innkeeper, we already talked about. Blacklands Paragon is just nice because you can look like you're out of place and just flash him in, or you can just flash him in if your opponent has nothing left on board, and then get in a sneaky attack later, right? One thing you can do also is, depending, you can put your Filemire Knight, and if your opponent is going to swing into him anyways, and you're kind of short on life, you can flash in your Blacklands Paragon, give the Filemire Knight lifelink and Death Touch, and well, he already has Death Touch, but lifelink, get a tiny bit of life, block and kill the creature, and then you still have a 3/1 blocker for later, which is pretty good. Mausoleum's Secrets, I don't really use this card very often. Of course, it is a one of, but basically it's a way to find a Smitten Swordmaster. Right, so it's just an easy way to get that Smitten Swordmaster out when you need it. Okay, Order of Midnight. This card is surprisingly good, right? It's just actually really crazy because what you can do is you can you can get your Smitten Swordmaster out, right? You can cast it or whatever, bring it out, put it onto the battlefield, chump block with it, and then return it to your hand, right, from the graveyard using Order of Midnight. So you can get that Smitten Swordmaster back, right? And and sometimes that's pretty much how you can win the game. Okay, Once Upon a Time is just nice. Again, it helps you to fetch out certain things and get your colors online. Especially, you want to look for Edgewall Innkeeper, or yeah, I think that's it. You can only look for a creature or land, so you can't look for Lucky Clover, but you can look for Edgewall Innkeeper with it. All right. Midnight Reaper, of course, just great value because you're going to lose some creatures sometimes. You take a damage and draw a card. It's okay. We want to draw cards. Okay, Murderous Rider. Again, with Lucky Clover, you can destroy target creature or planeswalker and you lose 2 life. Now, be careful. I've actually accidentally killed myself with this. Right, one time I had 2 Lucky Clovers out and Murderous Rider, and I took 6 damage and just killed myself because I only thought I was being stupid actually, and I thought I might only take 4 damage. But then afterwards, he comes down with Lifelink, which is fine because then you're going to get your 2 life back if you block with him anyways. So Murderous Rider, is a great card. This is just value town. All right, Castle Lochwain. Castle Lochwain, it just comes in untapped if you control a swamp. You're going to almost always control a swamp. Draw a card, then you lose life equal to the number of cards in your hand. That's fine when you're just running short. Sometimes this comes in handy, but you generally have so much card draw that you don't even really need to worry about this. 7 swamps, 4 forests, and then Overgrown Tomb, Temple of Maladies for Scry, and Fabled Passage just to thin your deck and also get your green mana whenever you might need it. All right, so that's pretty much the deck. Now, the big thing is that, man, this can really come out of nowhere. Like, if you have a Lucky Clover, and let's say you got 2 of them down, which I've actually had 2 or 3 down, right? As soon as you cast Smitten Swordmaster, then you copy your Lucky Clover, right? And then basically, if your opponent has 6 life, or let's say you have 6 knights down, right? Then you can cast Smitten Swordmaster, right? And put it, copy it twice, or copy it one, or let's say you got 2 of them down, you can copy it twice, and you're doing 18 damage with one of them. Right, so because your Smitten Swordmaster will trigger 1 time, Lucky Clover number 1 will trigger, and then your Lucky Clover number 2 will trigger. You could do like 18 damage with 1 Smitten Swordmaster. That's just ridiculous, right? And then like it can just be really crazy like that. So I mean, this is okay. I don't know. It's just kind of crazy how effective this is, and I actually thought that you would just die out, but you actually just don't. It's kind of weird. But anyways, what I would suggest is that this is kind of good for people who are like that sort of mid game, come from out of nowhere type win, right? You can, and I have occasionally ground someone down with this deck, but really what it is that you're just building up a presence. You're just making kind of discouraging blocks and stuff like that, and then you're just going to try and come out and smack people down with the Smitten Swordmaster whenever you can, right? So overall, this is very competitive. I found, like, I don't know, I would guess I probably win 75% of the matches I play with this deck. It's pretty good. The only problem is it gets a little dull after a time because you're just basically playing the same strategy over and over again, right? So I mean, it's okay, but it gets kind of boring, so I don't play it really that much. Sometimes if the daily rewards require you to play a certain number of black spells, then I'll play this because it's mostly black, right? So anyways, that's deck number 1. Okay, deck number 2 is Fancy Folio. Now, I have to say, I did not make any of the decks that I'm showing you today. These are all different ones I found online. Some of my favorite places to check for decks is Mono Black Magic, sometimes Bad Boy Gaming. Covert Go Blue is pretty good as well. And yeah, those are my main places for inspiration. Sometimes I'll find something on MTG Goldfish, but yeah, anyways, this one, I forget where I found this, but this is super, super fun deck. This one kind of reminds me of Owling Mine in Modern, where basically what you're doing is you're giving your opponent a really high amount of cards and then punishing them for having so many cards. And you're also making it so they can't play cards. All right, so there's a couple of cards that are really the keys here. And so the big keys are Folio of Fancies. All right, now I would consider adding a fourth Folio of Fancies and maybe taking out one Root Snare, because you really need Folio of Fancies, right? In fact, I think I will do that. I'll take away one, add one there. All right, you really want to get a Folio of Fancies in your opening hand. Okay, now Folio of Fancies basically says players have no maximum hand size. Great. All right. You can pay double XX and each player draws X cards. Okay, so that's great. It's kind of a big group hug. We're drawing lots of cards. So everyone's got cards and no maximum hand size. Great. And then what you do is when your opponent has a lot of cards in hand, or even if they don't, you can punish them by paying 3 mana, and each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyard, right? And you'd think like, well, okay, but you're giving your opponent a lot of cards. Yes, you are, right? So what are we going to do with that? All right, so come down here, we've got Rule of Law. Okay, so Rule of Law says each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. So what we do is we stopped our opponent from casting any spells on their turns, right? By limiting them to just one. So you're going to get them to draw a shit ton of cards. And then what you're going to do is you're going to prevent them from casting them more than one at a time. All right. Now, sometimes against control matches, this can be really tough because they can cast a lot on your turn. But what I found is that most decks, especially in the meta now, cannot cast anything on your turn. All right. And then what you do is, well, you play Wilderness Reclamation, right? So we're going to try and get up to Wilderness Reclamation, and at the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control. Now, these 3 cards together, okay, the Wilderness Reclamation, Rule of Law, and Folio of Fancy sets you up. So on your turn, what you can do is, let's say you've got, I don't know, like 4 or 5 lands out. Okay, you can trigger Folio of Fancies, right, to draw 2 cards. You already have your Rule of Law out, and then you have Wilderness Reclamation. So you spent all your mana to draw these extra cards, right? Well, then Wilderness Reclamation allows you to untap your mana, untap all your lands at the end of turn and give your turn, then pass the turn to your opponent. That's where the rest of the cards in the deck come. All right, so the rest of the cards are all basically ways just to stop your opponent. So when your opponent finally tries to cast something, you hit them with a Sinister Sabotage, right? Or you hit them with an Absorb, right? And basically you just prevent them from casting any spells at all. All right. If you're looking for those spells, you can use Drawn from Dreams to get them, right? And if you've used them all up, then you can use Drawn from Dreams or just get Tamiyo, and Tamiyo can bring them back from the graveyard, right? Or search for them or bring them back from the graveyard and cast them again. And basically you're just trying to stall your opponent. All right. We also play Teferi, Time Reveler, and Teferi, what he can do is you can use his +1 ability. So I've seen a lot of people forget about this, but until your next turn, you may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. So we play Teferi on our turn. We +1 him. Our opponent drops down like a creature or something like that, or let's say they already have a creature. Then what you can do is cast Time Wipe on their turn. Normally you can't, but because his +1 says you can cast sorceries on your opponent's turn, right, then you can cast it, right? So return a creature you control to your opponent's hand. We don't have any creatures, then destroy all those creatures, right? So then we just blow up their whole board, and ideally they will have already played a creature, right? We blow up their whole board, and then, and then they really can't do anything about it, right? And then until their next turn, and then we just draw more cards and sit on our Sinister Sabotage and our Absorb. We also play Root Snare. Sometimes Root Snare is really good to have because it makes it so that like we just don't have any way of blocking, especially in the early game, right? So it can block some of those early attacks until we can get Time Wipe on. Growth Spiral is a good way for us to just draw cards, and sometimes like the deck's a little land heavy sometimes, so it allows us to put those lands into our onto the battlefield. Especially good is if you play like say a Hallowed Fountain and then a Forest or something like that, and then you can drop like a Temple Garden or a Breeding Pool into the battlefield, and you don't have to pay your 2 life, right? Because you can just drop it in, don't pay the 2 life, and and then it'll untap on your next turn, right? So you can see we play a ton of lands. So we got like 4 Fabled Passages, 4 Temple of Mysteries, 4 Breeding Pools, 3 Temple Gardens, 4 Hallowed Fountains, and a Forest, 2 Islands, and 2 Plains, right? But pretty much this is super, super fun. Like you wouldn't think that it would be nearly as competitive as it is, and I really didn't, but really it is. And you end up milling out your opponent so fast, right? And like, your opponent can have like one card, and there's times when this will go to like, past round 10, right? So because you're just stalling the game so much, right? So you get to round 10, you force your opponent to draw 5 cards, and then on your next turn you trigger Folio of Fancies. Like you might even have 2 of them out, so you trigger them twice, right? They mill 10 cards, right? And then you just keep stopping them with Sinister, Sabotage, and Absorb, and yeah, it makes it so they just really can't do anything. Overall, I'd say this deck is super competitive. If you like mill, you should like this deck. It can be a little bit tricky, especially sometimes if you tend to get, because it plays so many lands, it needs a lot of lands. You can sometimes get mana flooded, but overall, it is a really fun deck to play, and it's right up my alley. Anybody who's a longtime subscriber to the channel knows I love mill and those sort of trolley type decks like Owling Mine and stuff like that. So, I mean, this is just it's a really fun deck. It's probably my favorite deck to play. All right, so let's move on. Okay, my third favorite deck to play is one that I call Korvold's Sacrifice. Now, Korvold's Sacrifice is basically, as you'd suspect, is a sacrifice deck. Now, the thing I like about this deck is just got so much synergy and so many triggers, right? Like everything works together so well. It's super fun to play, and I've only ever played one mirror match with this, right? So not a lot of people are playing this. So we start off with 4 Cauldron Familiars, and of course we're going to play 4 Cauldron Familiars and 3 Witches' Ovens. You'd think we'd go 4, but I found that overall you don't need to have 4 Witches' Ovens. All right, so we've got 4 Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven, and basically what we can do is continuously cycle those over and over again. Very often you'll end up with both of these in your starting hand. What I would suggest is playing the Witch's Oven first, mainly because if someone later on forces you to discard your Cauldron Familiar, then you can always end up sacrificing something else to get a food token, and then bring the Cauldron Familiar back from your graveyard using that food token. Right, so if you have a choice between turn 1 Witch's Oven, turn 1 Cauldron Familiar, play the Witch's Oven first. All right. Anyways, then we have a Gilded Goose. So Gilded Goose is just a little bit of ramp, gives us a food token in case our Cauldron Familiar gets killed and we can bring it back, and also gives us some stuff to sacrifice later. All right, also plays 4 Priests of the Forgotten Gods. Now, most of you guys are going to know this card, but what it does is it says you can sacrifice 2 other creatures, and any number of target players each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. You then add 2 mana and you draw a card. Right, this can sometimes, if your opponent can't get rid of this card, it can just be a killer. Right, you can basically, they put anything onto the board, you can just sacrifice it and sacrifice your stuff and just kill them off. Right, like a very common thing that I like to do, for instance, is I'll block with I'll get Cauldron Familiar out, Gilded Goose out, and then block. I'll get all 3 of these cards out. And that happens quite a bit. You'll have Priests of Forgotten Gods. Your opponent swings in. You block with your Cauldron Familiar and immediately sacrifice it to Witch's Oven to get a food token. Right? Then that creature is still blocked, and then you can bring it back. Right? And then you sacrifice your Gilded Goose and Cauldron's Familiar again. Right, and then also because when your Gilded Goose came out, you would have a food token. So once you sacrifice your Cauldron Familiar, then you can bring it back again, right? And then you only need 1 other creature to sacrifice, right? And it can just be so brutal to your opponent to do this to them. And not only that, if you do it on your turn, right? Like ideally you would have about 3 mana. Getting that extra 2 black mana can get you one of your 5 mana things out. Like we'll talk more about these, like either Korvold or Moldavine Reclamation, which pretty much is like almost a game ender, right? So anyway, so Priests of Forgotten Gods, great card. Okay, Midnight Reaper, of course, is when a non-token creature you control dies. Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card, but that's okay. You know why? Because most of the time, when we get this out, we'll have a Cauldron Familiar and a Witch's Oven, and we'll sacrifice our Cauldron Familiar, right? It dies, we lose a life, but we draw a card, then we immediately sacrifice the food token to give the Cauldron Familiar back. Our opponent loses life and we gain 1 life. So overall, our opponent just lost a life, and we stayed neutral with life, and we ended up drawing a card. So it's a great card draw engine. Now, where things get really interesting ideally, you would play something like this. Turn 1, Witch's Oven. Turn 2, Priest of Forgotten Gods. Turn 3, Chandra, Acolyte of Flame. Now, I never use her +1 or her put a loyalty counter on each red planeswalker you control ability. I always just say use the 0 here. So you can create 2 red, 1/1 red elemental creature tokens, right? Now, if you've got the Priest of Forgotten Gods, you can create these 2 tokens, swing if it's safe. Like if your opponent has an empty board, then swing away, and then as soon as the combat is over, then sacrifice the Priest of Forgotten God, sacrifice them to the priest, right? And then, or sacrifice them to the priest or to the Witch's Oven, get a food token, right? And then, that's fine because and yeah, overall, like you're just going to get tons of food tokens out of it, or if you sacrifice them to priest, then you force your opponent to draw a card or discard a card or whatever, right? So it's just straight value town if you can get Chandra to do that. All right, so next one up is Mayhem Devil. So if you can cast Chandra or Mayhem Devil, you should do Mayhem Devil first. All right, because what he does is, what Mayhem Devil does is, whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target. Now, that's not just to a player, that's any target at all. So we're going to be sacrificing stuff all over the place, and that's not just when we sacrifice, that's even when our opponent sacrifices. So if your opponent plays a Fabled Passage and sacrifices, you get to ping them, right? So what we ideally get is Chandra, Mayhem Devil, and then Chandra. So Chandra creates her 2 red elementals. If we can sacrifice them to Priests of Forgotten Gods or to Witch's Oven or whatever, then we get to ping our opponent. There's a lot of 1/1s and stuff like that out there that we can use to constantly ping. If our opponent brings out a Planeswalker, you ping them down with that. It gets ridiculous. Like later on, you can just sacrifice so many things. Right? Moldavine Reclamation says whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life and draw a card. So again, if you can get Moldavine Reclamation down, then what you can do is have your Witch's Oven, Cauldron Familiar, you sacrifice that. Your Moldavine Reclamation gives you 1 life, draws a card, and so on and so forth. And so you're just drawing so many cards, gaining so much life. This deck there's just a lot going on, and I imagine in paper it'd be really hard to keep track of all the triggers, but on Arena, like at least it keeps track of it for you, and yeah, it's just awesome. Finally, we have closing out the game is Corvold. Now you can get this out on turn 4. Right, so what you can do is on turn 2, you get your Priest of Forgotten Gods. Turn 3, Chandra, right, and then on turn 4, you create your 2. You create your 2 elementals. You sacrifice them, right? You get to you sacrifice them to priest, right? Your opponent sacrifices their creature to loses 2 life, and also you get 2 mana and draw a card. Then you use that 2 mana plus your existing 3 to cast Corvold, Fake Cursed King. Right? Once that comes in, you got to sacrifice something else, and ideally you'll probably have a food token lying around, or if you need to, then you can sacrifice a Cauldron Familiar or something like that. Right? Or I usually just sacrifice a land, because we're going to have so much land it doesn't even matter. It's just sacrifice a land. He gets a +1/+1 counter and draws a card. Right now, just a word of advice is that don't sacrifice anything to Witch's Oven until it's your opponent's turn, or until your opponent's end step, unless you absolutely have to. Right? The reason why I say this is because a lot of times your opponent will use like a Legion's End, for instance, or some other kill spell on one of your creatures, and you can't avoid those things. But instead of allowing your opponent just to kill that thing, what you can do is sacrifice it to Witch's Oven instead, and at least then you get a food token out of it. Right? So, there's been times when I get out Corvold. Corvold still has summoning sickness, and our opponent uses a spell to kill him. Right? Well, okay, that sucks. I lost my Corvold, but at least I can sacrifice him to Witch's Oven and get a food token back out of it. And then later on, I can use that to chump block with Cauldron Familiar and bring it back. Or if I get another Corvold, I can sacrifice that food token. Right? So very often, Corvold will just the amount of draw that you get off of this is just ridiculous. Right? So remember, with both Corvold and Mayhem Devil, when you sacrifice something to Cauldron Familiar, or Cauldron Familiar to Witch's Oven, right? Then you've made 1 sacrifice. right? But then when you bring it back, you also sacrifice the food, right? So like it says sacrifice a food, right? Return culture familiar. So that's another sacrifice there. So there's a third one. If you can have two witches ovens, right? You can do this twice. That's you're basically doing it twice per oven. That's 4 sacrifices each. And then if you happen to have a fabled passage down as well, right? Then that's a 5th one. So like they could have like a 5/5 creature out there, and you could just ping it down one at a time, right? So I mean, this deck can be really, really crazy. It's got tremendous synergy, and it's a lot of fun to play. Besides the Fancy Folio, this is probably my second favorite deck to play. All right, in fourth place is a mill deck. All right, so this is just straight up Dimir Mill. This is mostly, I believe, this is from Strictly Better MTG, and a lot of times, a lot of love out to Dev over at Strictly Better MTG, but sometimes with the decks he creates are, they're okay, but when you actually go to play them, they're not fantastic. This one's actually pretty competitive, and I'm a huge mill fan, so of course I had to try it out. Right, so basically what you're trying to do is basically just get as much value as you can from Drowned Secrets. All right, so we got, we got Drowned Secrets, and there we go. Okay, whenever you cast a blue spell, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. And then basically everything else we have is a blue spell, right? Ideally, what we want to do is use Merfolk's Secret Keeper, right, to mill our opponent. So first we have them put the top 4 cards into their graveyard. Then we use Drowned Secret. We have Drowned Secrets first. Then we make them put 4 plus the 2 from Drowned Secrets. Then we cast a Merfolk's Secret Creature, and having a 0/4 onto the battlefield is actually pretty nice, right? Same thing with Wall of Lost Thoughts, right? So basically the same thing as Merfolk's Secret Keeper. Instead of doing it once, spending your mana one at a time, you just have to cast it both all at the same time. Then we also have Drown in the Loch. Okay, so Drown in the Loch is a nice counter spell or destruction spell. So this one is actually pretty good. Just be careful because it has to be less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. So early game, this is not that good, but very quickly in the game, this is going to turn into basically counter anything. Okay, Thought Erasure. Now, a lot of times people will wait on Thought Erasure, because what they'll want to do is get a Drowned Secrets trigger off of it. But remember, we don't have a ton of ways to deal with some major problems, especially like planeswalkers, or I guess we have some ways to deal with planeswalkers, but some bigger creatures, hexproof threats, things like that, right? Those can be really troublesome. So an early Thought Eraser is basically the same as removal and just gets rid of those things so we don't have to deal with them at all, right? So even sometimes just using this to get rid of a potential mana rock or something like that, or a Gilded Goose, can make it so that your opponent just can't do anything afterwards. So overall, early Thought Erasers is a good idea. Okay, Tyrant Scorn is basically removal again, so destroy target creature or return a creature to its owner's hand. Now, I've used this, especially towards the end of the game, where a person swings in, I block with Merfolk's Secret Keeper, and then I use a Tyrant Scorn right before the damage phase, right, to bring it back to my hand. So the creature is still blocked, but I got the Merfolk Secret Keeper back, and then I can recast it twice again, right? So on the next turn, then I can use it to mill my opponent again, and also get the body down again, right? And usually by that time it's game over, right? We got 3 Murderous Rider. Murderous Rider is just straight up value, right? You can destroy target creature or planeswalker. Try and hold off on this, and because once your opponent puts a planeswalker down, especially if they're playing blue, because they might have a stupid Jace in there, and so right at the end they might throw down their Jace and then try and win off of that. If you've got a Murderous Rider, you can basically kill that Jace and they won't be able to win off of it. All right, Ashiok is pretty good. Now Ashiok kind of hurts us in a way, and I'm pretty sure that's why we're only playing 2, because it hurts our Drown in the Loch, right? But sometimes it can be really good because our opponent our opponent sometimes might be trying to reanimate stuff, and if you have this, then you can basically exile their whole graveyard every time. So Ashiok's pretty good. Being able to mill 4 every single time for 5 times, it's 20 cards, right? So if your opponent can't stop or doesn't want to deal with Ashiok, it's just going to get a lot of value out of it, right? We're going to have to deal with creatures a lot. So we have Ritual of Soot, destroy all creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less, which is just, again, really good. Enter the God Eternals, deals 4 damage to target creature. You gain life. This just helps to keep us into the game. It also mills our opponent 4. It also triggers Drowned Secrets and also gives us a body. So, it's expensive at 5 mana, but overall it's good value and it helps to keep us in the game. All right, we also have Liliana Dreadhorde General, a pair of those. This can be our win condition, so especially to force our opponent to sacrifice 2 creatures, right? And then after that, then we can just use our +1 to keep us alive, right? We have Into the Story. Into the Story 7 mana, but lets us, only costs 4 if we have 7 or more cards in our opponent's graveyard, right? And that's almost always going to happen. So it's like 4 mana, draw 4 cards. That's crazy, right? So being able to draw 4 cards just refills your whole hand, and yeah, it can be straight up value. It also triggers Drowned Secrets as well. Okay, and then after that, we just got basically our land package, just Castle Ventress. It allows us to scry later on. Island, Mystic Sanctuary, can put an instant or sorcery card from the graveyard back on top of our library. Our Castle Lochwain, Swamp, 4 Dismal Backwaters, which gives us a little bit of life, and some Watery Graves. So overall, this is not terribly competitive. I still probably won more than I've lost with it, but I would say it's probably like a 55 to 60% range. It's sometimes you can just get totally blown out with this, especially if you play against a red rush deck or something like that. You just have no chance against it, or your opponent brings out an Oko against you or something. You just can't deal with that. So it's you're just not that fast. So it is what it is, but I do love Mill, and if you love Mill, then you should play it. My only concern is that there's a surprising number of rare cards here. So if you don't have these cards already, it sometimes can cost you a lot of rares to build this, right? So we got like 4, let's see here, another 3, so 7 rares. That's 9, 11, and yeah, so 13. Yeah, so 15 rares and 2 mythic rares. So this can cost a lot. Like 15 rares, if you don't already have these cards, can be, it can be a lot, especially for a deck that's not that competitive. Like it is competitive, but not super competitive. So, if you're really a fan of mill and you love milling your opponents, then by all means play this. But if you're looking at, you only have enough wild cards to build 1 or 2 decks, I wouldn't recommend this one. Okay, and last but not least is mono red, to my shame. Now, I personally think that if you watch my ban and restricted video, you'd see like many of the cards here are in the ban and restricted one. So I don't really think that Torbrand, Thane of Redfell should be like, I think he should be banned. I think Risk Factor should probably be banned. Cavalcade should probably be banned. The rest are okay. Chandra's Spitfire as well. I don't think these are a lot of very fair cards. Now, I'm not a huge fan of mono red, as you can tell from like the type of decks that I had previously played, like the other 4 decks that I showed you. I mainly play in Dimir colors like blue and black, sometimes with white as well, but I don't play a lot of red. So you may ask, like, well, why do I even have this deck at all, right? And the reason why is because a lot of the decks I play don't have any creatures, but sometimes the daily challenge, right, in Arena is you have to attack with so many creatures, right? Well, I don't have any decks that attack with creatures, or not really, right? And so if I need to meet the daily challenge, I need to have a creature-based deck to attack with, right? Now, my other decks, like the Smitten Shotgun and Corvold Sacrifice decks, those have creatures in them, but I rarely attack with them. I just use their activated abilities a lot, right? So I'm not actually usually attacking with those creatures. And so if your daily quest is to attack with 30 creatures, right? Like, well, that could take you forever, because you're rarely ever attacking. So with mono red, you do attack all the time, and so you can meet those daily quests like fairly quickly with them, and that's why I have this deck. I don't really play it unless it is to get a daily quest, because I find this deck to be kind of boring. Now, this is not saying I know some people out there really love mono red and they really love this form of deck, and it is actually quite competitive. It wins, a lot because it comes out so fast, but yeah, it's just kind of boring because it's basically the same thing every time, right? I don't really find it to be that exciting of a deck to play. There's not a lot of difference. Like there's synergy, I guess, but I don't know. There's very few decisions that you actually ever make in this. Yeah, you guys can all blow me up in the comments over that statement there. All right. So, anyways, the other thing is it's relatively cheap, right? There's not a lot of rares that go into this. So we got Torben is a rare, Risk Factor is rare, Legion War Boss, but there's only 2, right? Bone Crusher Giant is only 2, right? And then I think, yeah, that's it, right? So I think there's like 8 or 9 rares in the whole deck, right? So I mean, it's competitive. It doesn't have a lot of rares. You can win a lot of games, and it also allows you to attack with creatures to meet your daily quests. So essentially, all it is that you're going to try and get this Cavalcade of Calamity down as much as you can. Your opponent, it's weird because it's supposed to be random, but you almost always start with this in your opening hand, right? I think this is one of the things with Arena. It's like their broken shuffler. Like I think what they do is they somewhat rig the shuffler. I have no proof of that, but it seems weird that like you would just get Cavalcade all the time in your opening hand, right? But anyway, so you're going to try and play like turn 1 something like a Scorch Spitter, turn 2 Cavalcade of Calamity and attack, and then this will do 1 damage, 1 combat damage, 1 of its own damage, and then Cavalcade will also do another damage. Then you're doing 3 damage at a time. Then after that, what you're going to try and do is get down any one of basically any number of these guys, these little 1/1s, to a triggered Cavalcade. You're going to support them and block, basically destroy any creatures that come in using Bone Crusher Giant. And if you can drop a Chandra's Spitfire, then you get her stupid triple prowess, right? So you can, if you have like 3 of these guys, for instance, and a Chandra's Spitfire attacking at the same time, right? Like, let's say you got 1 Scorch Spitter, 1 Tin Street Dodger, 1 Torch Carrier, right? And a Chandra Spitfire, and you attack, and you also got Cavalcade out, right? Well, when you attack, Cavalcade's going to trigger once for each of these guys, right? That's going to be three activations of the Spitfire's abilities. So that's already going to be +9. Then also Scorch Spitter deals 1 damage to target a player, right? So that's going to be a 4th activation. So this thing will be a 13-3, right, when it attacks. And basically that's the end of the game, right? So very often you can close out the game on turn 3 or 4, or very, very closely to that, between 3 and 5. It's very fast, very effective, right? Legion War Boss as well is very good. Yeah, I mean, it's fine, I guess. Like it's an effective deck, and it's not that expensive as far as your wild cards go, so you can get it going pretty quick, and it is competitive. So I understand why people play it, but it's super boring, and like, it's just such a straightforward way of playing it. I don't know. It's not my style at all. However, I feel like I have to play it, especially because sometimes, like for 750 coins or whatever, like those really big wild cards, it would be like, you have to play so many red spells, or you have to attack with so many creatures. And, all my decks typically are not red and don't use creatures. So, so I feel like I have to use this. Anyways, to my shame, I do have this deck. But anyways, those are my top 5 decks. If there's a deck that you like, why don't you throw it in the comments and let me know. Or if you think there's something I should be playing, like a cool, neat bit of jank, then let me know in the comments as well. Remember, if you do like the videos I make, remember to like and subscribe. Yeah, and just let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.